Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Sallallahu ala Sayyidinā Muḥammadini wa ālā ālihi wa ṣahbihi ajma'in. Of course, it's a great joy to be back in the Nusantara region again. It's always a pleasure to see the adab and hospitality of the people. This is, of course, a question that is high in the list of concerns of very many Muslims in our time, and perhaps it helps to begin by reflecting on a certain shift in the Islamic conversation about how we understand ourselves as a global community, as an ummah. There was a time when we saw ourselves primarily in terms of deen. Now sometimes we find Islam described as an ideology. And there's a danger, I think, of falling into the trap of assuming that the success of the ummah is measured in essentially secular terms, economic performance, political outcomes and the like. Now, of course, Islam is a religion that encompasses the political and the economic as well as the doctrinal and the devotional, has concerns in those areas, and those concerns are shared by every believer. However, the real core of the religion is the focus on tawheed and the ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his remembrance. That is ultimately what the prophets ﷺ were sent with. So if we shift the optic from a kind of rather Eurocentric and secular one to the sacred optic, focusing on what really matters for the ummah and what was really central to the concerns of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we could say that the global community of Islam at the moment is an extraordinary and almost unique success story. Just in the country which I inhabit, the United Kingdom, the number of Muslims has grown by 60% in the last 10 years. We now have 3,000 mosques at a time when the churches are more or less empty. I often reflect on the irony that the church in the east of England, where my father was baptized and my grandparents were married, the family church, has for the last 30 years actually been a masjid. So I tell them rather ironically that I'm the only one who's keeping up the family tradition, because I'm the only one who still goes to that building, and they give me a look. But they know that the other religions are falling away and experiencing an extraordinary decline in attendance, whereas Islam continues to pack out the mosque. So if you don't get to the Cambridge Mosque in time for Jummah, you're likely to be praying on the street, being rained on. So it depends on your optic. If you see the Ummah as essentially a political and economic venture, then you don't need to read many headlines to realize that there's a major crisis underway. But if you regard the Nasrullah as being something that is for the inward and ultimately the more important aspects of maintaining Tawheed, the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, keeping up his worship in a very secular age, Islam is the great exception to the secularization thesis. It's the great success story of today's world. So I don't really buy the idea that there is a crisis of Islam. There is only a crisis of Islam amongst those who insist on shrinking it to the dimensions of an ideology and forget that it's far, far bigger than that, and it's actually a deen. Now, there's another aspect, of course, to this, which is that, as I've said, Islam does include the political. It does concern itself with the deliverance of good and just and compassionate and righteous governance, and with an economic system that cares for the poor and the mustad'afin and those categories for which the institution of zakat and the prohibition of usury and the other distinctive Sharia economic platforms have been launched. So we do need to deal with that question and look it in the eye. I think one reason for the apparent recession of the divine nāṣir or tawfiq from the political arena in the ummah has been the fact that we have neglected the fact that it comes when we support the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, وَإِن تَنْصُرُوا اللَّهَ يَنْصُرْكُمْ وَيُثَبِّتْ أَقْدَامَكُمْ. If you give victory to Allah, in other words to his cause, he will then give you the nasr and he will make your feet firm. We have not, I think, been sufficiently assiduous in doing this, partly because of our own essential refusal of the principle of Muslim unity, endless carping between different groups, more and more people setting themselves up as independent and competitive sub-entities within the ummah, neglecting the divine commandment that this ummah is to be ummatun wahida, a single ummah. But also the fact that because of this shift that I mentioned away from deen and towards ideology, so much Islamic work nowadays seems to be almost secular in its concerns. You can hear Islamic speeches and even khutbahs where the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, let alone the name of the Holy Prophet, is hardly to be heard. People are so concerned with a just political restitution that they're no longer particularly interested in the core practices of dhikr, salat, siyam, and so forth, and this is increasingly a problem. If we look over the history of this ummah and look at the times of perhaps equal or even greater crisis, we find that the context for Allah's support always comes about not through the sort of brilliant technological marshalling of superior force, but rather through the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and ikhlas and Muslim unity. Take, for instance, the extraordinary Muslim victory, hardly expected by anyone, over the Mongols. The Mongol invasions in the 13th and 14th century were probably a greater catastrophe than anything that most Muslims are facing now. The potential physical extermination of every member of the Ummah, the prohibition of halal slaughter, the prohibition of prayer, the prohibition of the adhan over the Mongol territories, including in great and ancient Muslim cities like Samarkand and Bukhara and Baghdad, an unimaginable catastrophe. And the Muslims then, as now, raised their eyes anxiously to heaven and said, when is Allah's support? Mata nasrullah. But it came, and it came spectacularly, in the form, in Allah's time, not in our own impatient time, through the conversion, an amazing outcome, not just the defeat, but the conversion of the great Mongol rulers and khans to the Tawheed of Islam. How did that come about? It came about really through the dhakirin, through those who were remembering their Lord, those who remember that dhikrullahi akbar, the remembrance of Allah, is the most important thing. And one of the things that we can usefully do for ourselves in these difficult times is to look at the way in which the Ummah dealt with the appalling catastrophe, the black hole of the Mongol prohibition of the religion of Islam, and to see that it was the people of the tariqas who actually pushed back against the Mongols and were eventually the instruments, the occasion, the sabab for Allah's victory. So the great stories of the conversion of Berke Khan, of Ghazan Khan, at the hands of the people of Tariqa, the hands of people like Saifuddin Yahya Bakharzi, the hands of people like Imam Yahya Kubrawi, and the great Naqshbandi, Qadrihi, Rifa'i sheikhs in particular of Central Asia, whose memories are still sanctified as names of great Islamic universities and colleges in those Central Asian countries. It was those people who fearlessly preached and who melted the hearts of the tyrants of the Mongols, and because of their dhikr and their submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah's victory came. But it was only through them that it came. Similarly, the conquest of Istanbul, one of the great events in world history, came about when Sultan Mehmed Fatih, contemplating the walls of the city that had withstood Muslim armies for 7 centuries, wondering how he was going to deal with this. Of course, we know the famous story of the cannon, but the cannon is just a sabab. It's Allah's permission that really opens gates. Made sure that before the general charge, the tariqas from his army went to the front. So the Naqshbandis went between the army and the city walls and did their dhikr while the Greek defenders were watching. And the Qadris and the Bayramis and the great tariqas of the Ottoman army. The Sultan himself was particularly close to the Bayrami tariqa because he had a sheikh in tariqa, Aq Shamsuddin, who was a remarkable scholar who'd brought him up to be the great hero and somebody who overcame his nafs as well as the Byzantine Empire, a mujahid of the inward as well as the outward. And because of those adhkar, of all of the tariqas, before the seemingly impregnable walls of Istanbul, Allah granted his nasr. So we need to look at these facts of our history and to remember, unless we have those dhakirin at the forefront, and unless we revive the principles of dhikr and the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout the ummah, unless we push back against those people who seem to see Islam as a purely literal or surface phenomenon or an ideology, then it may well be that the divine support and succor and victory will be indefinitely withheld from us, to the extent that instead of following the way of those people and of dhikr, we have recourse to ugly things that bring the name of Islam into disrepute, such as terrorism, extremism, the persecution of minorities, furious denunciation of other points of view, all of these ugly things that have come about in the ummah to fill the space left by the retreating principle of dhikrullah, I think we may face a rather gloomy few years or even decades. But alhamdulillah, we find everywhere that the tariqas are coming back. And I've just come from Saudi Arabia and was amazed to discover what a national conversation they're having now, and how in the newspapers and the radio and the television they're all talking about the problems of fanatical literalism and the destruction that has brought on neighboring countries. And I found so many of the young people returning to the principles of tariqah and the principles of dhikr, especially the educated ones who are just fed up of a kind of narrow doctrine, and they want to get back to the true deep meaning of the Qur'an and the hadith, which has dhikrullah as its fundamental principle. So alhamdulillah, I see many causes for hope as the Muslims realize that ideological interpretations of Islam just seem to add catastrophe to catastrophe, and as they start to realize, particularly young and intelligent and sincere people, that the way forward is through following the ways of Imam al-Ghazali. I was invited to give a lecture, for instance, about Imam al-Ghazali in Riyadh, a public lecture, which a few years ago would have been regarded as difficult. So many of the young people really are thirsty for traditional Islamic knowledge, for Sufi knowledge, for the knowledge of tariqah, and it's very refreshing to see the huge transformation that's taking place there. So alhamdulillah, even though we're going through a tunnel in the political and economic life of the Ummah at the moment, I see so many sort of buds and shoots of new hope as dhikr and our wonderful mainstream traditions of the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are once again making their presence felt. So alhamdulillah, the Holy Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, kan yuhibbul fa'l, used to love optimism, and I do see many grounds for optimism despite the fact that so many of the horizons around the Ummah today seem to be rather dark.